Crop circles appear in more than 50 countries, and there literally have been thousands of them, maybe over 10,000 crop circles that we're aware of in the modern era.
A single number can undo 50 years of certainty, and this is that number, 12,000. That is roughly how many crop circles have been documented since the late 1970s, spread across more than 30 countries, and for half a century, almost nobody looked at them as a single continuous record. They were treated as isolated events, one field, one summer, one headline, filed away, argued over, and forgotten by the next news cycle. But when a pattern recognition system was finally given the entire archive at once, stripped of every belief, every legend, every assumption about aliens or hoaxers, and asked one narrow question: how has the complexity of these shapes changed over time? It returned something nobody expected. Not a verdict on who made them. A curve. And that curve does something that should not be possible if the story everyone has been told is the whole story. To understand why that curve matters, you have to start with the place where most of this happened. Wiltshire, in southern England, is a landscape that has been marked by human hands for thousands of years before a single crop circle ever appeared. Stonehenge stands on Salisbury Plain. Avebury holds the largest prehistoric stone circle in Europe. Silbury Hill, a colossal mound of chalk raised around 2400 BC, sits nearby, built by people who left no written explanation for why. This corridor of chalk downland, dense with monuments older than the pyramids, is overwhelmingly where the modern formations have concentrated. That alone invites a mundane explanation. It is popular, accessible, and full of people primed to notice something strange. But it also means that whatever has been happening in these fields has been happening in one of the most closely watched landscapes on Earth, for the better part of half a century, in full view of farmers, tourists, researchers, and eventually satellites. The earliest formations on record are almost laughably unremarkable. Through the late 1970s, at sites like Cheesefoot Head in Hampshire and across the Wiltshire Downs, what appeared was nothing more than a single circle, a patch of wheat or barley pressed flat, the stalks swirled in one direction, smooth as combed hair. No rings, no attachments, no geometry worth analyzing. A circle is among the simplest shapes that exists. One center, one radius, one unbroken curve. To a farmer walking his fields at dawn in 1978, it was an oddity, a lost afternoon of yield, maybe a whirlwind or a deer's mating ground, mentioned to a neighbor over a fence and forgotten by lunch. To a machine reading the sequence decades later with no memory of how unremarkable this seemed at the time, it was something else entirely, a baseline. Line one of a document that would take 50 years to write. What makes the story worth telling is that the shape did not stay simple. Through the early 1980s, the lone circle began acquiring company, not scattered randomly, but arranged. A large central circle flanked by smaller satellites at even spacing, like a diagram someone understood before they drew it. Then came quintuplet sets. Then rings nested inside rings. A single circle in a field can be dismissed as wind or wildlife. For circles arranged with obvious intention are much harder to wave away, and by the middle of the 1980s, the geometry had hardened into something that resisted the word accident. Smaller circles were connected to larger ones by narrow corridors of flattened crop, producing shapes that looked like keys, like dumbbells, like characters from an alphabet nobody had been taught. And crucially, these designs revealed themselves properly only from above, composed for an aerial eye, not for someone standing in the crop at 2 in the morning who could see no more than a few rows in any direction. Photographers began chartering light aircraft because it had become obvious these things were never meant to be appreciated from the ground. Then, in 1990, something happened to the pace of change itself. Before that year, the growth in complexity had been gradual, a little more symmetry each season, an extra ring, a steadier hand, the kind of progression you would expect from someone practicing and slowly improving. But in 1990, the curve did not step upward. It jumped. On July 12th of that year, in a barley field below the Alton Barns White Horse, a formation appeared that stretched roughly 600 feet from end to end. Not a decorated circle but a full composition of circles, rings, rectangular boxes, and forked corridors so intricate the press began calling it a pictogram, because it resembled writing more than art. Similar formations appeared at Chilcombe Down weeks earlier and at Stanton St. Bernard weeks later. The following summer, at the foot of Barbury Castle, a triangle roughly 180 feet on each side appeared, with 3 enormous circular features at its corners, each internally different from the others, a ratchet spiral in one corner, concentric rings in another, requiring a plan drawn to scale beforehand and executed at night with no visible reference points, at a size where a single degree of drift would have wrecked the entire design. Nothing in the years before it prepared observers for that leap, and nothing in the record shows a gradual bridge between the old, modest formations and the new, elaborate ones. One season the fields held simple sentences. The next, they held paragraphs. It was in this atmosphere, in September 1991, that the story received its most famous human explanation. 2 retired Englishmen, Doug Bower and Dave Chorley, walked into a newspaper office and announced that they had been making crop circles since 1976, using nothing more than a plank of wood with rope loops at each end, a length of string and a stake to hold a radius, and later a baseball cap fitted with a sighting loop of wire to keep long lines straight in the dark. Bower, a picture framer from Southampton who had spent years in Australia and had heard stories of a supposed saucer nest found in a Queensland reed bed, and Chorley, a landscape painter, claimed the whole thing began as a joke between 2 friends drinking on Friday nights near Cheesefoot Head. They demonstrated their technique for reporters, and at least one formation they created on camera was authenticated as genuine by a researcher who examined it without knowing it was staged. They claimed more than 200 formations over roughly 15 years. For a great many people, that confession closed the case entirely, and it genuinely explains a great deal. It accounts for the concentration of formations in Wiltshire, where the 2 men lived and drank, and it accounts for the timing around 1990, by which point they had been quietly refining their technique in private for over a decade before going public. Once the phenomenon became famous, it also attracted imitators and successors, and this part of the story is not hidden or disputed. The collective known as Circle Makers, founded by artist John Lundberg, has openly produced commissioned formations for advertising campaigns and television productions for 3 decades, using surveying tools, garden rollers, and GPS instead of planks and string. In 2002, a team assembled by the Discovery Channel, including researchers from MIT, built an elaborate formation overnight that passed casual inspection from visitors the next morning, demonstrating that with the right tools and enough planning, remarkable precision is achievable by ordinary people working under time pressure. This countercase is genuine and strong, and anyone examining this subject honestly has to sit with it. What it does not neatly explain, however, is the near-simultaneous appearance of dramatically more sophisticated designs across multiple countries, the Netherlands, Canada, the wheat fields of New South Wales, inside the same narrow window around 1990, a spread far faster than a technique could plausibly travel by word of mouth between secretive amateur groups working at night. While the public argued over who held the plank, a smaller group of researchers shifted their attention from the shapes themselves to the plants inside them. The central figure here is W.C. Levengood, a biophysicist based in Michigan with a career background in plant physiology and seed research, who beginning in the early 1990s examined samples pulled from formations in England and the United States, working alongside Nancy Talbot and John Burke through what became known as the BLT research team. His findings were published in 1994 in the journal Physiologia Plantarum and again in 1999 in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. The work itself was unglamorous, cutting stems at the base inside a formation, then walking beyond its edge to cut identical control samples from untouched crop nearby, then measuring the swollen joints or nodes along dried stalks with calipers. Levengood reported 3 recurring anomalies. First, that nodes inside formations were often significantly elongated compared with controls taken just outside the boundary. Second, that some node walls showed what he described as expulsion cavities, tiny ruptures blown outward from within the stem, consistent with moisture flash heated into steam rather than a stalk simply crushed from the outside. Third, that soil samples from some formations contained unusually high concentrations of tiny iron-rich magnetized particles, with a structure consistent with material that had been melted and rapidly cooled. His proposed mechanism involved localized plasma vortices, spinning columns of ionized air capable of delivering brief microwave-range energy bursts. That research deserves an honest counterweight, because it has been challenged, and not always unfairly. Node elongation can occur naturally through gravitropism, the process by which a stem knocked down by wind or rain reorients itself toward light, stretching its lower joints to do so. Critics including Joe Nickel and Francesco Grassi have argued that comparable readings have sometimes been produced from crop known to have been flattened by ordinary hoaxers, and that the publication record supporting Levengood's more dramatic claims is thin, with limited independent replication. BLT research was never an independent university department, and that matters for how seriously any single finding should be weighed. So the physical evidence sits, honestly, in an uncomfortable middle ground, not proof of anything extraordinary, but not nothing either, and it establishes that whatever has been happening in these fields left something measurable behind beyond the picture on the surface. By the mid-1990s, the geometry had acquired a quality harder to dismiss than beauty. It had acquired mathematics. Gerald Hawkins, a Boston University astronomer best known for a 1963 paper published in Nature arguing that Stonehenge functioned as an ancient astronomical calculator, turned his attention to crop formations in the 1990s and reported that the area ratios between their component circles repeatedly matched the diatonic ratios of the musical scale. He identified 4 geometric theorems embedded across different formations, then derived and published a 5th theorem containing all of them as special cases, one he could find no record of in the surviving body of classical Euclidean geometry. Within roughly a year, a new formation appeared containing a construction that satisfied his 5th theorem. Then, on July 7, 1996, in a field opposite Stonehenge itself, a formation appeared known as the Julia set, a fractal spiral built from around 150 circles of varying diameter arranged along a curling arm roughly 900 feet long. A fractal repeats its own structure at shrinking scales, the way a coastline or a fern does, and rendering one accurately by hand is a task of extraordinary discipline. Witnesses reported the field empty in late afternoon and the formation complete within an hour, in daylight, beside a busy tourist road, a claim that has been disputed but which nonetheless sits attached to a design whose existence and complexity are not in dispute at all. 5 years later, at Milk Hill in August 2001, a 6-armed spiral containing 409 individual circles spread across roughly 800 feet appeared in a single night. Then the formations crossed into an entirely different category. They began producing data rather than merely patterns. In August 2001, beside the Chilbolton radio telescope in Hampshire, 2 formations appeared within days of each other. One depicted a human face rendered in blocks of standing and flattened crop, an image that reads as meaningless stripes from the ground and resolves only from directly overhead. The other was a direct, altered response to the Arecibo message, the radio transmission beamed into space by Frank Drake and Carl Sagan in 1974, which encoded the numbers 1 through 10, the atomic numbers of the elements of life, the structure of DNA, a human figure, and the layout of the solar system. The Chilbolton formation reproduced that same grid structure but with deliberate alterations, a different chemical element, a different planetary arrangement, which required not artistic skill but precise bookkeeping, laying out more than 1,600 individual cells in darkness with no way to step back and check the work as it progressed. A year later, at Crabwood near Winchester, another face appeared, this one holding a disk composed of blocks that decode, when read as a sequence of present and absent elements, into ASCII binary, spelling out a legible English sentence. Nobody seriously argues that a machine could identify who typed that message. Both formations are widely regarded, even by researchers sympathetic to the subject, as almost certainly human work, and highly skilled human work at that. But the significance isn't authorship, it's capacity. A spiral is ornamental. A binary string is a container built to hold something, and by 2002, the containers were holding real, decodable payloads. That distinction is what allowed the analysis to shift from asking what the shapes looked like to asking how much information they could theoretically carry, based on element count, nesting depth, and structural order. Scored this way, the 1978 circles land close to 0. Through the 1980s, that number crept upward gradually, the way a child's vocabulary grows one word at a time. After 1990, it stopped creeping and began climbing. With the fractals, the embedded theorems, and the binary messages of the 2000s, it climbed again, more steeply than before. Plotted across 50 years, the resulting curve does not resemble a flat accumulation of scattered, unrelated events. It bends upward and keeps bending, closer to compounding growth than steady addition. The shape, mathematically, of a system maturing rather than a hobby simply getting lucky more often. Extend that curve forward using nothing but its own trajectory, and the projection lands somewhere between 2030 and 2035, the point at which the most complex formations, if the trend holds, would theoretically be capable of carrying as much structured information as a page of written language. What the analysis actually proved is narrow, and it deserves to be stated precisely rather than dramatically. Across 5 decades and multiple continents, the marks left in these fields have grown more intricate, more mathematically ordered, and more information-dense along a curve too smooth to be pure coincidence and too abrupt at 1990 to look like ordinary, gradual human skill building alone. What that pattern is actually for remains exactly where it has always been, out of reach, above the field, in the dark. There are, honestly, only a few ways to read it. It may simply be us, 2 men with a plank becoming a global subculture with lasers, then GPS, competition sharpening technique the way competition always does, and every anomaly in the plants no more than the ordinary behavior of stems that have been lying down for days. It may be something else layered on top of that human activity, using a shared canvas in ways not yet understood. Or it may be, as the coldest reading of the numbers suggests without ever quite saying it, something for which there isn't yet a name, a process refining itself toward a clarity nobody will recognize until the day it finally arrives. What stays with you isn't the mystery itself, but the patience of it. Somewhere in the chalk downs of southern England, within sight of stones raised 4,000 years ago by people who left no explanation of their own, the fields still fall in July and August, in the weeks after the wheat has grown tall and before the combines come. And by every measure available, the shapes are still getting more intricate rather than less, in a decade when a 50-year-old joke should long since have run out of laughter. Maybe that really is all it ever was: boards, rope, skill, and quiet pride refusing to fade. A curve is not proof of a sender, and a pattern in the crop is, at bottom, a pattern in something, which is not the same as a pattern from someone. But it is worth asking yourself honestly now, before the next summer arrives, if a message clear enough to read finally appeared in a field between now and 2035, would you trust yourself to read it? Or would you already be certain, all the way down, that someone very clever had simply put it there to fool you?